Thank you, Toby. Big green one? There we go. There we are. My name is Jeff Kebler. Excuse me. I'm a principal with Milliman here in Sydney. So I appreciate Milliman isn't a household name in the financial advice circles. Milliman is, at its core, an actuarial consulting firm. It's been around for about 70 years now, founded in the United States, 1947. So I work with a lot of actuaries. 5 or 10 years ago, if I was lucky enough to see the light of day and speak at a conference, it would have been on very highly technical matters like interest rate models or the volatility surface. But increasingly, we're working with humans. So we recognize that there's a human element to financial planning, and at the coalface of where everyday people interact with financial services. So we're much more focused on that part of the market, and that influences the work that we do here. So before I begin, when we talk about building the perfect retirement income, it reminds me of an episode of The Simpsons. And just because I have to do the math, the show has been on the air for 29 years now, 630 episodes with an average running time of about 23 and a half minutes. That means it would take about 9.5 to 10 days to watch all of the episodes if you didn't take any breaks for the bathroom or eating or sleeping. So there's quite a lot of material there. So just due to random chances are one of us would have a slide that relates to The Simpsons, because there's a lot of great material out there. So in this particular episode, if you haven't seen it, Homer Simpson was reunited with his long-lost half-brother, Herb. They'd been separated at birth. So they led two very different lives since their paths had split. Herb was the successful CEO of an automobile manufacturer, and Homer was the average American. So Herb was so enamored with his brother, and he felt that he embodied the average American. He was the everyman, and he thought that Homer would have the insight into building the most successful car that he could possibly deliver. So he convinced Homer to build a car for him. He said, "Homer, I'll let you do anything you want. Go away and build a car for me, and let's see what it is." Well, this is the result. So it failed. It failed massively. It bankrupted his brother, but it had everything Homer wanted. So it had 3 horns that played the cucaracha, because he said you can never find a horn when you want it. It had a bubble in the back for the family, and it had an engine that sounded like the Earth is coming to an end. So that reminds me of the issues we face with designing retirement incomes in a couple of ways. One is that there are a number of products that have been launched over the years with many bells and whistles. Oftentimes, the decisions have been made by the sales force, which historically has been aligned with the advisor force, especially in the United States, less so here. But more relevantly, I think the discussion now that the government is having about comprehensive income products in retirement, or CIPRAs, or My Retirement, it's really about this theoretically pure way of coming up with the perfect retirement income. So it raises 2 questions. One, are we asking the right questions about what should be in our ideal retirement income? And 2, are we giving the right people the keys to the design room when they construct these products? So what I wanted to talk about today, the agenda I have here is, first of all, what do retirees need in the way of retirement incomes? Second, how can managed accounts deliver these retirement incomes or outcomes? And then I'll finish up with some case studies relating to the work that Milliman is doing in the space. So we identified that there was a real gap in the market in terms of understanding what retirees actually spend. So far, the only benchmark that's out there that's commonly used is the ASFA benchmarks that are put out by the ASFA group. The approach that they've taken there is really to assume what is the average retiree. And they go to such a level where they say, the retiree, we know what they wear. So we know that the average retiree wears 1 pair of Crocs and 1 white singlet and 1 Akubra hat. And then they work that out to they last for about 2 to 3 years. So there's a per week cost that they can attribute to that. And that rolls up into the comfortable and the modest standards. And then what they've done to validate those standards is they've interviewed 30 households that they found at a yacht club in Sydney in 2009. So it doesn't really represent the whole population. So what we did is we partnered with a local data analytics firm, Quantium. leading data analytics firm that has data assets from National Australia Bank and CoreLogic that covers property, and Woolies shopping basket data. So there's really interesting things where you can see when lifestyles change on the fly. You can see when a household switches from premium brands to the home brands. You can see that there's a change in the financial circumstances. And it covers about 3 million Australians in total, and about 300,000 of those are in retirement. So it's a really great, really rich data set that we can interrogate and ask questions about what do retirees actually spend. There are a few things that we can point out just by looking at this chart here. So what I'm showing is the average household spend for a couple by different age bands, showing the 25th percentile up to the 75th percentile. And I do recognize that a lot of these numbers may seem low. They're surprisingly low to us. But especially if you're working with high net worth clients, these levels of spend would be a lot lower than what you're used to seeing. We have those numbers as well, but I thought I'd present these just to show kind of the middle of the road. First of all, the decline in retirement spending, which is a lot sharper than people expect, or what ASFA is showing, is really part of an arc of spending that people experience through their whole lifetime. So it's not just the case that when people hit retirement, the money dries up and they're a bit more conservative. Really what we see is that there's an arc of spending that starts at 25 when you don't have as much money. And actually 25-year-olds spend a disproportionate amount of their money on leisure and fun things. And then as people get into their 30s and 40s, responsibility kicks in. They've got families to support, mortgages to pay, and spending really peaks around 45, 50. And then it starts to taper off, and then that continues into retirement. So there's nothing special about retirement. It's just part of a much broader trend. So there's a variation of about 30,000 between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. Location really matters. So we can't talk about nationwide stats of retirement because it's so different for people in different locations. There's a 30% variation in the household couple spend at 65. Interestingly, the biggest spenders are in Canberra. We suspect that's due to the prevalence of defined benefit pensions in the government. And then what you see is that Sydney and Melbourne have high cost of living, and then that decreases in regional areas of the country. And averages are skewed by the big spenders. So a small number of relatively affluent people will skew the averages. So usually, if you want to look at the middle of the road, it's the median is what you'd want to look at. And I guess I'll make two assertions here. One is that good information is key to engagement. So when you're working with your clients, you need to stay engaged. You have very few points throughout the year to speak with them. Usually they only ring when the market's down. Just how I don't call my plumber every time the toilet flushes. I'd call him when something goes wrong. So you need good information to engage with people. And then the second thing is that bad information will disengage. It'll lead to disengagement. And there's there's an example I have of that. I was at a presentation by one of these new superannuation funds that was targeted to females. So, as we know that the outcomes, there's a real gender disparity in terms of outcomes in the superannuation system due to lower overall wages, time out of the workforce, and longer life expectancy. But the approach that this particular fund had taken to run focus groups is they were speaking to a small number of women who unfortunately were divorced later in life and had very little asset balances. And they said, ASFA says you need $60,000 a year and you need a superannuation balance of $700,000. And people broke down in tears. They literally broke down in tears. So rather than being able to work with them and say, well, maybe a little bit more invested in super will increase the standard of living you can experience on top of the age pension, which already provides a very a certain baseline. They would switch off right away. And I think that has an implication to everyone in the room here, because it's easy to find the high net worth people and demonstrate the value of financial advice there. But how many people are turning away from the advice community when they're disengaging from the whole topic of retirement and retirement savings? So continuing on here, what's in the basket? So we break it down here by the percentage of spend by age. So as we've shown in the prior slide, overall spending is declining through retirement in real and in nominal terms. But the proportion of what people are spending on changes through the years. So the most obvious thing, I guess, would be health. So at 65, health is about 12% of the overall basket, and then that increases to twofold to just about 24% at age 85. As we expect, spend on transport and travel, that becomes a smaller proportion of spending through the years. And then food remains relatively constant as a percentage of the budget, so that's kind of suggesting that people are kind of calibrating their eating habits as they get older. And then things like clothing, communications remain as a relatively small part of the budget. And then, if we take this data and think about how do we construct incomes through retirement, what does it all mean? So, especially in the Treasury submissions about constructing My Retirement or CIPRA, they're saying that the default retirement should most likely be something that's inflation linked throughout retirement. Acknowledging that the cost of living does increase. And I think there's a nuance that's being missed here commonly in the industry. So, by all means, if money is being put aside, if current consumption is deferred and put in risky investments, by all means, that money should outpace inflation. Otherwise, you're taking a step backwards. But it's not necessarily the case that incomes need to be linked to inflation. So the green dots that we're showing, the dotted line on the top there, that's if we take the starting age 65 level of spend and just inflate it at, I use 1.9% a year based on what the RBA is suggesting. The orange dots on the bottom there, that's what we observe retirees today spending. Now that's in today's dollars. So if we just inflate that on the same basis, that's the blue line. And we see that there's a really big gap there of over $15,000. And so what that means is if people are constructing retirements based on this commonly held assumption that they need an inflation-linked retirement income stream, they're going to be underspending when they're 65 and more able to spend it on travel and leisure, and then have more money at later ages when the data suggests that they might not need it. So bringing it back to the topic today, how can managed accounts help? So you've heard from the panel earlier on the flexibility and the range of assets that managed accounts allow and all the other reasons for using them. You'll hear later from Terry on some really hard data on how using managed accounts actually leads to higher profitability of advisor practices. But from my point of view and for the way we look at it, we see it as it addresses these key issues. So a lot of retirement products today, they're built for the masses, so they don't speak to the individual. Oftentimes they're inflexible, so if you want to purchase longevity projection or some of the other products that are out there, you give up flexibility, access to capital. When we see in the spending data that people need flexibility because the biggest drivers of their overall spend are the things that they have the least control over, like health. Opaque. So you can purchase longevity protection, but it's not really clear to the end customer or the advisor that what they're really buying would be a range of risky credit assets packaged up as a stable income stream. And expensive. And I don't mean expensive in absolute terms. I mean in terms of perceived cost. So oftentimes we hear that people think that guaranteed annuities might be expensive. And from an actuarial point of view, that might not be the case. There's the cost of capital that providers have to wear, and the profit margins really aren't any higher than other products that are out there. But there's a perception of being expensive. And what do managed accounts facilitate? Well, they're tailored and flexible. So getting to this idea of a personalized retirement. Transparent, so people have full visibility of all the assets that they're holding in the account, and efficient. So we know that managed accounts are part of the puzzle in helping reduce fees. And the proof is in the pudding. So the numbers show that there's a 25% year-on-year growth in managed accounts. So people are hearing the message. So I just wanted to walk through a couple of case studies on some of the work that Milliman's doing and how it relates to managed accounts, or rather solutions that can be deployed in a managed account situation. So the first one is goals-based analytics, and this is the technology platform we've developed to support goals-based advice. So I think goals-based advice sounds like kind of an insulting term to be a new buzzword when we all know that advisors for many years have taken goals into account when they sit down with their clients. But what's been missing so far is the technology to take those goals into account and quickly on the spot evaluate them and communicate back to people what is the outcome. So on the left-hand side here, this is the efficient frontier. that we're all familiar with. It relates to modern portfolio theory, which has been around since the 50s, and it ties in risk and return. And in this efficient frontier framework, it says, well, for a unit of risk, how much return can we get, and it helps people see what is the optimal portfolio. But it requires the individual to understand how risky are they. And people are notoriously bad at self-identifying how risky they might be. There's a lot of work that's done on questionnaires to try to identify how risky someone might be, and it might be framed in terms of would you sleep at night if the market went down 10% or 20%, or ranking funds in terms of the likelihood of negative outcomes every 10 or 20 years. But it's a very hard concept for people to identify with and engage with. And what often happens too is that people end up in the middle. So when presented with a list of choices, especially if there's too many choices, 9 times out of 10 people are going to end up in that moderate portfolio just because it's in the middle. And finally, this notion of risk and return, it doesn't translate into real world goals. It doesn't say, well, how likely are you to meet your goals in retirement? So what's new with goals-based advice is coming up with goals and measuring those goals. So what I'm showing on the right-hand side here is just a framework that we've developed here to come up with a retirement income score. What that score does is it rewards scenarios where we meet the income goal, and that income goal is calibrated to the spending data that we have, and it penalizes the situations where we fall short of that goal. So it recognizes return and risk in a different way. And what happens when we run it through this framework is it's not always the case that the most risky or the least risky portfolio dominates. In this case, where the lower score is better, actually the aggressive portfolio is better for this particular client. I think that has if I think about lifestyle funds and things like that, quite often it is the case that people should de-risk as they get older, but that's not the case for everybody. For certain people with certain situations, it might be the case that more risky assets are required as they get older. We shouldn't assume that everybody needs to move into bonds, especially when rates are at historic lows, just because they're getting older. And this is the same software that's being rolled out in the market now with IMAP and the Goals 360 platform that they're developing, and that's letting people sit down with advisors and drag and drop their goals on a timeline and evaluate how likely they are of meeting goals, and then recommending products that will optimize those goals. And it's very computationally intensive. Measuring the interactions with the age-based pension and any goals that people might have, and it runs in under a second. So sequencing risk, what is it? Well, I mean, everyone in the room here would know that over a long enough time frame, there's very little risk in equities. Historically, it's hard to find a case over 20 or 30 years where an equity investment would have lost any money. But we know that requires people to hold that equity investment for the whole time frame. So people might say they have a very long time frame. You might think that they have a very long time frame, but when the market heads south, there's human behavior that takes over, and people are more likely to sell. They're more likely to ring up, and we know that that's frustrating for advisors as they spend all this time to develop very well thought plans that are tailored to the individual, and then to have somebody call up as soon as the market heads south, even though over a long enough time frame they'll be fine, but having people change the plan at the wrong time. So risk managed funds are a way to help manage sequencing risk. Because when the global financial crisis happened in 2008, a retiree that's just starting their retirement and pulling funds out is going to have that'll draw down their retirement lifestyle by 30%. Whereas for someone who's 20 years old starting their career, the GFC was probably good for them because now their superannuation contributions are coming in at a lower level. So it's that sequencing of returns that impacts different people differently compared to the long-term average returns. So we have some great products out in the market now with Colonial First State and with Beta Shares that have our risk managed strategy packaged inside of it that smooth out equity returns in the long term. So giving up a bit of upside when markets are good and helping to cushion when markets fall using exchange traded futures contracts that are liquid and cash settled every day. So they're very transparent. What we've recently developed for the market applicable to managed accounts would be what we call even keel. So this is the risk management strategy that we have packaged up as a separate set of unit trusts, which means that it can work into a model portfolio. So if somebody has a set of model portfolios and they want to create risk managed versions of those model portfolios without having to sell out of existing long equity managers, they can just make a small contribution to the even keel unit trust, and that combines to give a risk managed portfolio. So it's really just designed to provide a smoother retirement journey for clients. And so it fits into existing managed account and advice frameworks without having to change existing managers. And it's flexible and it's transparent and cost effective compared to traditional retirement income products. So in conclusion, we see that there's a real trend to more personalized retirement incomes. So on one side of the spectrum, in the superannuation world, you have this idea of the default retirement income, and we're already seeing a lot of pushback in the industry from superannuation funds that are being forced to think about how would they default someone into retirement. On the other end of the spectrum, you in the room here know that it's different for everybody, and we have ways that we can help solve that. So data that leads to empathy, understanding, and trust. We'll be the first to say that if your clients come up to you with a detailed spending plan for their retirement, you wouldn't need our data, but often it's very useful to help pre-fill some of the assumptions about retirement incomes. Technology facilitates this, so both on the managed account side, which is really a tool to facilitate efficient portfolios, but also technology to efficiently calculate and evaluate goals on the spot. And then finally, managed accounts facilitate the use of all the building blocks that are out there to put together the right retirement income portfolios for your customers. And with that, I'll wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions about the data or any of the things that I presented.
Jeff, you put a slide up there, Jeff, on the changing in spending patterns. You want to just maybe unpack that a little bit with age, where you saw the spending patterns dropping off. Do you want to just unpack that in terms of what people are spending on at various ages, the major themes, and also maybe differences in things like geographies and things like that, spending patterns?
Certainly. So the first thing to acknowledge is that this is data for retirees today. So there's a broader macroeconomic trend, I guess, in that people retired at 85, had less time in the superannuation system. They retired on lower wages. So there's that to consider, and there's cohorts of people that are in this data, and we do have the access to the spending data over 10 years now. So we'll continue to look at trends of households. So the way that spending changes through retirement, it flows through in different categories and in different ways. So it's commonly assumed that health will be the biggest increase in spending as people get older. So it does increase in terms of the percentage of the basket, but the increase in health is actually less than for other categories. Now, the reason for that is the public health system picks up a lot of that variability. So people with health issues will spend more on health, but the real bulk of that health bill is still borne by the government. If you dive into the change in health spending, what you find is that people are spending less on private health insurance. They're not seeing the dentist as much, but they are spending more on general practitioners and pharmacies. So things like that. One slide that I didn't put up here that raises a lot of eyebrows is that if you look at the decline in leisure spend from 65 to 85, the biggest driver is a drop in alcohol spend. So that's $564 per year. So I showed that slide to our marketing and PR people, and they said $564 less a month. And I said, no, don't worry, it's per year. So you can still do a lot with that. And then you see a decline in travel, a decline in eating out in restaurants. So there's a real gradual change in lifestyle that occurs through retirement that we can tease out in the data. There's also kind of discrete jumps. It'll be at 65, they can be very active and travel as much as they want to. Then they might have minor health issues 10 or 15 years in, and then the later years of retirement can be very sedentary. So yeah, there's different phases of retirement that we can see in this spending data.
I've got a question, Jeff, which is the cohort of the population who actually get advice. So the cohort who many people in this room would see might well fall above that 75th percentile. So I guess, does Milliman publish that kind of upper market proportion? Because I guess there'd be more disparity between 75 and 95, say.
Yeah, so what we see is that it does a very sharp upturn in the higher percentiles. So that's, you see spending of well above 100, 120,000 a year, which even for some people might be very low. So we haven't yet published that. We're doing more increasingly to tailor this work for the SMSF sector. One of the partners in the data report that we do is the SMSF Association. So we want to have some more information that's relevant to that segment of the market. So yeah, we capture it all, and over time, I think we'll do more to tease out that part of the market. Yes.
Jeff, you were talking earlier about retirement incomes. Is that working okay? Can you hear?
Yep.
I'm just sort of curious about the trade-off if you're optimising for retirement income or trying to work out the right amount of risk, the trade-off between income and total return, and is there a gap there? The investor that says I want income from my investments and they want to receive it as income. Mm-hmm. In optimising for that, are you sacrificing total return, and therefore are they going to run out of capital sooner? And how do you sort of view that trade-off, and is the trade-off material?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think I guess I would say that's the idea of having income coming from dividends and interest alone and not sacrificing principal. That's purely behavioral. Especially when assets are in managed funds that are highly liquid. You can create your own income, but there's that behavioral aspect of having to sell assets that many people don't like. So we can certainly model that, and what you do see is your outcomes will be suboptimal. So it's the same thing as the, say, bucketing strategies, which are commonly used based on this idea that let's set aside 2 to 4 years in short-term cash, and then the bucket will be replenished over time. But then that doesn't account for what happens when the bucket isn't replenished and you have to sell assets. So really, a bucket strategy is suboptimal in the way that you're deviating from your best long-term asset allocation to have a bit held aside in cash, when your long-term assets, you could liquidate them on a moment's notice if you really needed to. So yeah, we do reflect that in the analysis, and we do see those sorts of trade-offs. But again, we do acknowledge that we're dealing with humans, and those behavioral concerns are very real and might be at the forefront of their mind. So it's just a matter of presenting the evidence in the right way, we think.